It's interesting as you read these Psalms, and like the first verse of Psalm 4, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Well, there's a song that we sing that starts out, I think it's even called, Hear Me When I Call. Beautiful song, and a lot of our songs are taken from the Psalms. And so I talked about that a bit last week. There's a lot in these two Psalms, and it's interesting because these are whoever wrote them, David, we typically say in most of them. These are circumstances that he's dealing with each day and thoughts that he's having based on the circumstances that he's finding himself in, writing by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. You know, we looked last week, I think it was last week, at a couple New Testament references that cite even like, from Acts chapter 13, where Peter is speaking, where Paul is speaking, he said, David says in the second psalm, and so it pinpoints that. And so many psalms are quoted in the New Testament, and many of them are not, but there's so much to take from each of these, and that's these two that we're looking at tonight are, as I read through them each day, I read them more than once. They're fairly short. You know, Psalm 4 is only 8 verses. Psalm 5 is only 12 verses. You can read it several times a day, and there's much, to me, encouragement in, I would say, any circumstance in life, but especially when sometimes things are not going so well. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. So let's think about righteousness for just a minute. You know, when we talk about that word, a lot of folks want to immediately jump and say, oh, there's none righteous, no, not one. And we'll deal with that as we go throughout the Psalms, because at least one of them says that. But the word righteous itself, here's the technical definition of that term: a right relation to an ethical or legal standard. So basically, you're right in the eyes of the law. And obviously, we're dealing with spiritual law here. And God, of course, is the standard of righteousness, and His law shows us what's required to be righteous. And so David is crying out to Him, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. And so to be righteous, that's not mysterious. It doesn't take a special class of people to be righteous. In Acts chapter 10, for instance, when Peter was preaching to the Gentiles, preaching to Cornelius, he said in Acts 10, verses 34 and 35, he said, of a truth, I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, or that is, He shows no partiality. But whoever fears Him and works righteousness is accepted by Him. So you can do righteous, and if you can do what's righteous, you are then righteous. Okay, so let's look at this real quick. Turn your Bibles to 1 John. Make sure I give you the right passage to turn to here. Okay, turn to 1 John chapter 3, and let's look at this quickly. In relation to being righteous and what it means to be righteous, and you guys, I'm sure you've heard me say before, if you want to know what it means to be righteous, just look at the first 5 letters of that word. To be right. That's what it means. 1 John 3. Somebody read 1 John 3, verses 6, 7, and 8, please.
Whosoever abideth in Him sinneth not. Whosoever sinneth hath not seen Him, neither known Him. Little children, let no man deceive you. He that goeth righteousness is righteous, even as He is righteous. He that committeth sin is of the devil. For the devil sinned from the beginning. For the purpose of the Son of God was manifested, that He might destroy the works of the devil.
Okay, so a couple things going on here. Whosoever abideth in Him sinneth not. And I'm sure we've had this discussion in here, and I'm sure you've heard it before. So you're looking at a King James Version, you've got those ETH endings, and those are present tense verbs. Whoever is abiding, it's present tense. Whoever is abiding in Him is not sinning. It doesn't say he who abides in him never sins. There's a difference in being sinlessly perfect and being a person who is abiding in him and is not keeping on in the practice of sin. And that's what verse 7 says. Little children, let no man deceive you. He that, the King James says, doeth righteousness. The New King James says, he who practices righteousness. All right, so he who does righteousness, what does that verse say about him? What's verse 7 say about him? He is righteous. So don't tell me you can't be righteous. And I think sometimes people conflate the thought of being righteous or being right with self-righteous. And there's a difference in being righteous and being self-righteous. What do we mean when we typically say self-righteous? That was two at once. Jeff, you started first. What did you say? Okay, and that's, you think it's all with you. Self-righteous. Well, if you do what's right, you are right. If you do righteousness, you are righteous. Yeah, there's no, you don't, no, you're doing what's right, and so therefore you are righteous. So in the Sermon on the Mount, so here's another good example. Well, we didn't consider verse 8 there, but verse 8, he who is committing sin, that is, he who continues in the practice of sin, is of the devil. For the devil has sinned from the beginning. All right, so over in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, as Jesus, so he has the Beatitudes in the first 12 verses, then he talks about being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And in Matthew 5 then, in verse 20, he says, for I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. God is the one, so Paul says it in Romans chapter 3. God is the one who justifies us. He makes us just. But we have to do what's righteous in order to be righteous. And that's not any reflection on God or saying that we have to do it ourselves. But it's just like Acts chapter 10 and verse 35 says when Peter was talking to Cornelius, whoever fears God and works righteousness is accepted by Him. So, and I don't know what it is. I think I know what it is. It's like people are afraid to say, it's like they're afraid to say that they are righteous or that we can be righteous, because if we say that, well, that's being self-righteous. No, it's not. So, the Bible says, hereby we know that we know Him, what? If we keep His commandments. And that would be righteousness, right? You'd be doing righteousness if you're keeping His commandments. We know that we know Him if we keep His commandments. He who is righteous, or he who practices righteousness, is righteous. God requires something of us. And so David is crying out to the God of his righteousness. So again, the definition of that term, going back now to Psalm chapter 4, is being in a right relationship either to an ethical or legal standard. God sets the standard. And I either match up with His standard, I'm right in the sight of His law, or I'm not. And that's not self-righteous. You have relieved me in my distress. And I like this word, distress, here at the end of verse 1, or in the middle of verse 1. And it's used quite frequently in the Psalms. Let me get back here real quick. But the idea is of something that's very narrow. You find yourself in a tight spot. Well, God relieved him when he found himself in a time of oppression, and that could have been any number of occasions in the life of David. When he found himself in a tight spot, in misery. That was another definition of that term, distress. God relieved him in his misery. And so have mercy on me and hear my prayer. How long, O ye sons of men? How long will you turn my glory into shame? How long will you love vanity and seek after leasing? Looking at the New King James, it says, seek after falsehood. How long will you love worthlessness and seek after falsehood? And again, that's kind of a theme presented throughout the Psalms of the wicked, that they're worthless, their activities are worthless. Trying to think of a good word, that's the best I can come up with. How long are you going to cling on to that stuff? The worthlessness. But no, so now in addressing those who are sons of men, okay, the wicked, those who are not righteous, know that the Lord hath set apart him that is godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call unto him. And so there's that line that's drawn, again, between righteousness, verse 1, and the sons of men, verse 2. And God has set apart for himself those who are righteous. He's set apart for himself those who are godly. Well, that's what we want to be. We want to be, so one of the words for set apart is holy. Okay? So the New Testament commands us to be holy. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, as he who has called you is holy, you be holy. God knows the difference between holiness and unholiness, between righteousness and unrighteousness. He's identified it in His Word, and so we can know the difference between those things, between what it means to be right, what it takes to be right, and then the description of one who is not right. And so what should the sons of men do in view of these facts? The King James in verse 4 then says, stand in awe. And this is an interesting difference. The King James says, stand in awe. The New King James says, be angry and do not sin. Well, so I did a little research on that word, because that's quite a difference. Stand in awe and then be angry, and both of them then say, do not sin. Well, the word means to tremble. So if you're going to be righteous, if you're going to be godly, as he talks about there in verse 3, then you're going to tremble in God's presence. You're going to have a respect for Him. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. Having the proper perspective of who God is, and inside of that, then who we are. And so we stand in awe of God. And we have that, it's been referred to as reverential awe, the great respect. Sometimes we see the word fear in the Bible. Fear God and keep His commandments, for instance. That's what we're dealing with here. That's what the godly person does. So God is not the way sometimes He's portrayed of a, kind of like the way I've described Him before, like a loving grandpa that's watching the grandkids run around and just, everything's okay because, hey, they're my grandkids. And just no anger, no justice. It's just, God is love and that's it. Well, God is love, isn't He? There's no question about that. 1 John 4 and verse 8. God is love. But we also have to consider, if we're going to stand in awe and understand who He is, and not only stand in awe, but sin not, verse 4. Then we also need to understand, like Paul says in Romans 11:22, behold therefore the goodness and what? Severity of God. Okay? He is it's like Hebrews 12:29, I think it is. Our God is a consuming fire. That's in the context of someone who has fallen away, who's become unfaithful. He's a consuming fire. And in Hebrews 10:31 it says it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And that too is in the context of those who, when you look at Hebrews 10:26, those who sin willfully. You don't want to stand before God if you've lived in sin willfully, because He's consuming, and it's fearful to meet Him. It would be fearful to meet Him in that way. So we, the godly, we want to stand in awe and sin not. Commune with your own heart upon your bed, verse 4, and be still. And then he says this, offer the sacrifices of righteousness. That's what the godly has to do. That's one of the things that the godly person does, the one who stands in awe. We offer sacrifices of righteousness. Somebody turn over real quick to Hebrews 13, please, and read verse 15. Hebrews 13:15. Okay, we continually should offer the sacrifice of praise to God. Well, of course, we understand under the old law that sacrifice was something quite different. You know, another verse I think of is Romans 12:1 and 2. We offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. So the godly man offers the sacrifices of righteousness, and we put our trust in the Lord. And see, that's the contrast of the unrighteous, the ungodly trust in himself, and that plays out throughout the rest of the Psalms. The godly man puts his trust, his confidence, is another way that word could be translated, in the Lord. There be many that say, who will show us any good? Well, again, David could have written that at many different points in his life with all that he went through. Again, being chased out of Jerusalem by his son, Saul repeatedly trying to kill him. You know, people could look at him and say, well, you know, if he were really a good person, people wouldn't be after him. Well, not necessarily. Well, would God show him any good? Lord, lift thou up the light of thy countenance upon us. You know, we talk sometimes about the fact that life can be dark, and we understand that, certainly. But if we're living with God, if we're walking with God, we're walking in the light. And life can still be dark while you're walking in the light, can it? It can still be hard and troublesome, but you can be walking in the light with the Lord even through those most difficult times of life. And again, if anybody in the biblical text understood that, it would be David and all that he endured. Thou hast put gladness in my heart. And again, this is in the context of people saying, well, who's going to show him any good? Thou hast put gladness in my heart more than in the time that their corn and their wine increased. In other words, what I have within me because of God is greater than a harvest. It's fulfilling. It's plentiful, you might say, because I'm right with God. Well, so Jesus tells us, I tell you what, somebody turn over to John chapter 10 and read verse 10 for us. I think a good thought here that we should never lose sight of. John 10 and verse 10. The abundant life that we talk about. Well, David, you know, he's writing approximately 1,000 years before Christ comes to earth, and he's talking about the gladness that's in his heart that's better than a full harvest. That's what God desires for His people. And again, that doesn't mean that life won't be difficult and at times dark. But even in the face of those times, we can be at peace with God. And that's verse 8. The way the psalm ends, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. You know, and so we talked about this a bit last week from Psalm chapter 3. If you look back up in Psalm 3 and verse 5, I lay down and slept, and I awoke. Well, sometimes life will keep you up at night. But if you're right with God, if you're, as John said in 1 John 3:7, if you're practicing righteousness, you can lay down and sleep. And if you were to wake up in the night with troubles, you know that you have the Lord as your sustainer, as your supporter. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. For thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. And so that, again, the contrast of David being surrounded by enemies who are questioning, well, is anybody going to show him any good? Verse 6, even in that context, whatever was going on in his life, he could still say, God sustains me through these times, and I can lay down and sleep at night. Any questions or comments on any of that?
I think one of the things that we can get out of that is the surety of living a righteous life and living righteously under God's law. And I base that up on, if we look back at verse 2, we see those statements ending with a question. But in verse 1, when David says, hear me when I call, have mercy upon me and hear my prayer. In verse 3, but know that the Lord has set apart him that is godly for himself. The Lord will hear when I call upon him. There's no question marks in any of that. As you pointed out a while ago, I think also we can understand, we need to understand the surety of God's promises. And one of the ways that it was illustrated to me is God's not only there to keep us from falling, but we know he'll be there to pick us up if we do.
Sure. And that's kind of that's one of the things I pick up in this psalm is being righteous doesn't take away all the problems, and it doesn't mean that I'm sinless and I never will stumble into sin. We know that will happen, but what also will happen is if we are righteous and that occurs, He's there. And, of course, I think of 1 John chapter 2 and verses 1 and 2. We have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. Sometimes when we think about that, what he says there in verse 8, I've got a couple things written in the margin of my Bible here I'll share with you now. I will both lie down in peace and sleep. Well, what keeps people awake at night? Worry? What's something that might keep you awake at night? Maybe a loved one is sick or suffering, or you've got something coming up at work, or what. There could be any number of things that disturb your sleep. Well, do you have any control over it? Maybe, maybe not. But that's beside the point. In whatever circumstance we find ourselves, we know that God is our sustainer, even in those times when I perhaps can't sleep at night. Yeah, turn it over to the... Well, there's this word in the New Testament, and Jesus used it when He was hanging on the cross. He said, Father, into Thy hands I commit my spirit. And that word means to turn it over. Well, He was handing Himself over to God. And it's used in some other places too, and I can't call them to mind right now, but that concept is also used throughout the Psalms, but that's the idea of, we hear people say that, turn it over to God. Well, what does that mean, though? Well, maybe it means I know I don't have any control over this, whatever it is, this circumstance or this situation, and so I pray to God for His will to be done. Maybe I do have some control over it. And so I think about what I can do, or perhaps what I shouldn't do. But, whatever situation we find ourselves in, the assurance is here. We can still have peace. We can sleep. God makes us to dwell in safety. He's my one of the images throughout the Psalms is refuge. It's a stronghold. That's what God is. Even in the times when I'm vulnerable and hurting, being right with God, that's what keeps me together. When it seems like everything's falling apart, I have a refuge in God, a strong place to go when the storms of life hit. Anything else on Psalm 4? All right, Psalm chapter 5. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my meditation. Hearken unto the voice of my cry. my King and my God, for unto thee will I pray. The word meditation there at the end of verse 1, the Hebrew word literally means my sighs. Not my sighs, my S-I-G-H-S, my sighs. Hear my groanings, my cryings when I pray. And give heed, pay attention. One of the things that the child of God is assured is in 1 Peter chapter 3, that the Lord's ears are open to the prayers of the righteous. His eyes are over the righteous, and His ears are open to their prayers. And so we have that assurance. In a lot of these psalms, there's some overlapping, and sometimes it seems like it's a continuation of the thought from one psalm to the next, even though it's divided into separate chapters. May be the case. My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning will I direct my prayer unto thee, and will look up. So, dedication and prayer. This is the concept of pray without ceasing. 1 Thessalonians 5:17. There's never a bad time to pray. And talked about this kind of thing before. There's no specific prayer posture. You don't have to bow your head. You don't have to close your eyes. You can communicate with God at any time. And if you're, again, Psalm chapter 4, if you're righteous, if you're doing what's right, we have the assurance that He will hear those prayers. And then here's the contrast. Thou art not a God that hath pleasure in wickedness, neither shalt evil dwell with thee. God will not tolerate it. And I think about that a lot when I read passages like this. God takes no pleasure in wickedness, okay? Evil will not dwell with Him. That's what verse 4 says. And then verse 5, the foolish shall not stand in thy sight. Thou hatest all the workers of iniquity. And we'll talk about that phrase, because I didn't think God hated anybody. Well, we'll talk about that. But I think, and I don't think this is a good thing, but I think sometimes we are more tolerant of wickedness and evil and foolishness than God is. Yeah, He does hate sin. But I'm talking about us. I think sometimes we tolerate more than God Himself will. And I don't mean not tolerate. We'll allow it more in our lives than God will. God, Habakkuk chapter 1, God cannot stand the presence of evil. Sometimes we tolerate it, and maybe we shouldn't. Yes? Okay.
Okay, so we can't, you're not allowed to hang a pedophile.
Well, is there a question? Do you have a question?
The question is, how can we not be tolerant of evil if the law says we have to?
Okay. Well, it's like 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, 1 Corinthians 5 addresses this because Paul does tell us there, if you wanted to get away from sin, you'd have to get out of the world. There's no, and so we understand that. But then he talks specifically to Christians with the Christian-to-Christian relationship. He says if a person's in sin who's a Christian, you don't even eat with them. That's no toleration. You don't eat with them, period. And then the fact that we are surrounded by sin, that's what I was trying to clarify, I guess, when I used the word tolerate, is we put up with it. And I don't think we should put up with it. So I'll give you an example. When I started working construction, I had worked at that some before Gail and I got married, and I continued in that after we got married for a while. And so this guy that I worked for, his in-laws were members where I preached, and so he knew I was a preacher. Well, apparently he had a meeting with his crew before I started working for him and told them all that I was a preacher. So like the first day of work, they called me aside, and they're like, all right, preacher, that's what they called me. They said, what words can't we say around you? I said, it's not me that you've got to worry about. So I explained to him, I said, I'm not your judge, but and I told him, I said, I don't appreciate, and I'm not going to use any foul language. There's no call for it. I'm like, okay. Well, that lasted for about 12 minutes. But the world needs to know where we stand, and the world often looks at that when you take a stand or you make a statement like that as, well, you're just judgmental. You're so narrow-minded and all of this stuff. But my point is this. If God takes no pleasure in wickedness, Psalm 5 and verse 4, and He doesn't permit evil to dwell with Him, what about us? Okay? That, I would say we do have some control over that some of the time. Not all of the time, certainly, and we understand we can't get away from evil, but when it comes to God, there is no tolerance for this, and the fools are not going to stand in His sight. So let's look now at the end of verse 5. Thou hatest all the workers of iniquity. Well, that sounds like God hates people. Well, when you do a little digging on that word, what it's saying here is you hate the doing of evil. And that's what He does hate. We know, of course, we know John 3:16. God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. God hates sin. He hates the consequences of sin. I would say both the temporal consequences, but also certainly the eternal consequences of sin. But the idea of God hating individual people, I think it's something a bit different here. You do not, or rather, you hate the working of iniquity, the working of sin. You will destroy them that speak leasing, the King James says. The New King James says, those who speak falsehood. And so he's now describing what it means, what God hates and what God does not tolerate. The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man, violence. God does not tolerate that kind of thing in individuals. But as for me, I will come into the house, into thy house, in the multitude of thy mercy. Verse 7. Well, if it weren't for the mercy of God, where would we be? And in thy fear will I worship toward thy holy temple. I really like the end of verse 7. Worship is, well, I'll tell you one passage I think of in terms of worship, because we talk about approaching God in worship and going to God in prayer and singing praises to God and things like this. It's not worship is not a spectator sport. Okay? Song leader and the preacher, whoever. I'm not here for your entertainment, folks. And I'm not here to meet your standards of what you think the preaching of the gospel is. And a lot of times that's what people make judgments based on their own opinions instead of, okay, here's what the Scripture says about this. And sometimes worship can fall into that trap where the leadership of worship is perhaps more concerned about what the audience thinks. It's not uncommon to see performances and quartets and choirs and one of the arguments made a lot of times is, well, these people are so gifted and they need to share it. That's like, I don't know if they do this anymore, but when I was a kid going particularly to elementary school, you had like one day a week for show and tell. You got a toy or something, you could bring it in and show it and tell people about it. And a lot of folks have turned worship into that. I've got this gift and I'm going to show you people my gift. And worship has been changed from this, I think, in thy fear, okay? In great reverence. This goes back to that word awe back in chapter 4 and verse 4. That's how I'm going to worship God. And the way we conduct ourselves in worship, it had better be in fear and worship. In fear in worship to God and done according to His standard. You're not going to please God by changing His teaching on worship. So lead me, O Lord, in thy righteousness because of mine enemies. Make thy way straight before my face. Well, here's the good thing. As David is contemplating these moments, whatever he's going through, asking for a straight path, well, we have a straight path, and it's right here. This is what guides us in our walk. And so we know the straight path, as we refer to it, the straight and narrow way. And that's how we conduct ourselves. The last few verses, and we'll just wrap it up here. As he then begins talking about the unrighteous, he says, "There's no faithfulness in their mouth. Their inward part is very wickedness. Their throat is an open sepulcher. They flatter with their tongues." And it's interesting because Paul actually quotes this in Romans chapter 3 as he's talking about sin. And David's talking about workers of iniquity. He's talking about evil people and how they conduct themselves. They've got, as we say, they've got loose lips. They're gossips and busybodies and backbiters and talebearers. And that's the type of people that we as God's people shouldn't be. "Destroy thou them, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Cast them out in the multitude of their transgressions, for they have rebelled against thee." And so you see a righteous anger here with David. He knows that people are doing wrong. Again, whatever circumstance was in his life, he knew that there was wrong being done, and he wants God to judge. And I would say you and I find ourselves in that spot sometimes. We're trying to do what's right, and we see all this wickedness around us, and it's like, man, how much longer? When is God going to do something about this? And that's not an uncommon question in the Bible. But let all those that put their trust in thee rejoice. Let them ever shout for joy, because thou defendest them. Let them also that love thy name be joyful in thee. And so again, you see that great contrast. And that word trust there, again in verse 11, is that idea of refuge, a safe place, even in a difficult and dark existence sometimes. "For thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. With favor wilt thou compass him as with a shield." Compass. You'll surround them. You'll protect them through difficult times. Any questions or comments on any of that? Mm. Oh. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Well, that's a good question, and perhaps what I said needs some clarification. Well, Jesus ate. That's why that's the thing. They weren't righteous. The Pharisees were not righteous. They were self-righteous, and that was their problem. They were surprised that Jesus would eat with the publicans and sinners, and that was his point. He said, "If you're well," which I think that was a bit of sarcasm. If you're well, you don't need a doctor. That's kind of a rebuke to the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. You don't need me. You're righteous on your own. Those who are sick need a doctor. And Jesus did eat with them, but he also taught them. And when he sent his disciples out, he said, "Go and preach, and if they hear you, stay there and teach. If they don't, you shake the dust from your feet and you move on." And I think that's kind of where I was going with that thought. All right, guys. Appreciate your attention.